Last thing I want to talk about from the 18th century is the development of new forms of music. And specifically talk about two rather famous composers from the time of church music, at least on the popular level. I mean, 18th century we could be talking about Mozart and others, but on the popular level, I want to focus on these two. One of them is Isaac Watts, one of the most famous hymn writers of the 18th century. Wrote about 600 hymns, many of which are still very popular. Hymns like Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed? How Shall the Young Secure Their Hearts? When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and of course the Christmas classic Joy to the World. He was a minister, a scholar of logic. His father had been imprisoned early in Isaac's life because they were dissenters, so they did not practice in Anglicanism. He learned the languages, many languages, very early on, and as he gets older, he decides that not only is he interested in ministry, he wants to reform hymnody as well. Felt that people didn't have an emotional connection to what they were singing. Their hearts weren't in it. And so he wanted to develop new styles that would help these churches connect to what they were singing. One of the ways that he approached this was through his Christianizing of the Psalms. And of course, the Psalms were, focused a lot on the Hebrew Jewish experience, Israelite Jewish experience. But he wanted to take them and kind of revise them as necessary to make them into things that Christians could use. Because a lot of the Psalms have a specificity that he felt people could relate to, right? It's usually an individual talking to God. Ultimately, he felt that there were 12 Psalms and a total of 285 additional verses in Psalms that he could not translate into Christian worship. I don't have that list. That came from a scholar who did focused on Isaac Watts' use of the Psalms. So I'm not sure which one specifically. But he felt that that was one of the things to do. Another thing that he emphasized as well is that a song sung by a congregation must be true for that congregation. Right? If it's not true for the congregation to sing, it shouldn't be sung. So even though he's developing new hymns, he felt that it should only be used if appropriate. Ultimately, he also would create hymns that were unique to the situations of the church that weren't reflected in Psalms, so songs about communion or things like that. That idea of singing with the Spirit and singing with the understanding was very important. Not everybody liked what Isaac Watts did to the Psalms. The irony here, of course, is that in the contemporary period, as contemporary songs are being developed, older people in churches want the old standards, like the Isaac Watts songs. Well, when Isaac Watts was the contemporary Christian music of the time, people didn't like Watts either. Okay? So new songs have always faced trouble, and so it's one of those things that happen. Traditional practice among, especially the Puritans, was known as lining out the Psalms a cappella. A leader would sing out a line of the Psalms, and then the congregation would respond with the same line. Right? And so that was kind of, especially for the Puritans, the way that you went about singing. But many people felt that songs invented by human beings that weren't divinely inspired were not appropriate for Christian music. And even Jonathan Edwards once complained about a church that adopted the habit of only singing songs by Watts. Later on, he would note the practice in his own congregation of incorporating one of Watts' hymns at the conclusion of a singing service. In addition to the famous songs that Watts wrote, he evidently also wrote some hymns for children, which are not evidently active in use across any denomination. But some of the songs also became popular more among certain slave populations. The other famous hymn writer that I want to talk about is John Newton. While Watts or Charles Wesley might be the most famous hymnist to come out of the 18th century. Perhaps the most famous hymn of the 18th century comes from the pen of John Newton. That hymn holds a prominent place among Christian hymns and continues to have that power even almost 3 centuries after it was written. Newton's mother died early in his life, and he would then go to follow his father to sea travel. His father was a merchant Navy captain. John would be forced into Royal Navy service. He deserted, only to be caught and publicly beaten. But eventually he convinced his superiors to transfer him to a slave ship, to which he would eventually become a slave trader. Looking back on this part of his life, Newton would claim that he was more of a free thinker or a deist and lived an immoral life despite his mother being a Christian and teaching him the Bible. For example, on his first slave ship, he would create obscene songs and poems about the captain, and then would get the crew to sing along these things, mocking the captain. He would serve on a variety of slave ships, and then later on in his life had begun reading some devotional material, which had started his conversion in a sense. When caught in a very dangerous storm, he begins rethinking his life and undergoes a type of conversion, but he still stays in the slave trade, working his way up to captaining his own ship. So he's kind of had this conversion, but still practices or still is involved in slavery, believing that a Christian slave trader has got to be better for slaves than other traders who have no religious views. He would eventually move into an office job with a slave trading company in the 1750s, eventually encountering the teachings of the Wesleys and George Whitefield, and decides to quit the slave trade, finally becoming disturbed by it, eventually becoming an Anglican minister. And when he becomes an Anglican minister, he begins a Thursday evening prayer service, where he also introduces the practice of writing a new hymn each week for the service. Often, many of those hymns that he would write would be tunes that were already existing, right? Tunes that people already knew, but then he would put his own words to them, and writes over 200 of these types of hymns. The poet William Cowper was also part of this service, and he would contribute hymns as well. Hymns that, again, are still found in a lot of hymn books. Hymns like God Moves in a Mysterious Way, There Is a Fountain Filled with Blood Drawn from Emmanuel's Veins. These are Cowper's. In 1779, he would publish Faith, Review, and Expectation, is the name of the song. Written probably in 1772 or 1773. You don't know that title. You know its opening line. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, which saved a wretch like me. Later in his life, Newton would become an abolitionist, joining with other British abolitionists like William Wilberforce. It's important here to note, right, that yes, Newton is the author of Amazing Grace, very powerful hymn, but Amazing Grace is not, right, in contrast to a lot of folk tales that get told, it's probably not related to Newton's thoughts or experience of slavery's abolition. That was more after he had left the ministry, and he left, and he was in a different situation when he wrote it. Right? So it's not this kind of. Sometimes it gets told when you hear the story, like he has this conversion during the storm, and he writes Amazing Grace, and that's what leads him out of the slave trade. No, historically that's not the case. He gets out of the slave trade for quite a few years, and then will write Amazing Grace later in life. Still, that doesn't change the power of the song. It's still a very powerful song, still a very meaningful song, but sometimes you'll hear a song leader say right before we sing it, right? Oh, this John Newton, he was a slave trader and he had this conversion experience and then he wrote this song. That's kind of shoving a bunch of historical events all together that probably don't go together. Questions about Watts or Newton? We turn now to the 19th century. The 19th century is often called the long 19th century, and it extends from late in the 18th century into the early 20th century in the sense that there's a lot of things that happen during this period in a lot of different areas. Right? There's political developments, there are cultural developments, right? The Industrial Revolution, scientific revolutions, all sorts of things are taking place in this 19th century period. And of course, part of the reason we think of so much is that we're talking about a period where better histories are kept, the information is better preserved than in previous centuries. But it is also a turning point for Christianity as well. A lot of things are taking place that change the role of Christianity in society and have an impact on how Christians see the world and how Christians practice their Christianity. And as I mentioned, with the amount of political things taking place in the 19th century, in the West especially, Christianity was involved with a lot of those. Where last we left the Holy Roman Empire, there were a lot of struggles between Napoleon and the Holy Roman Empire, France and the Holy Roman Empire. And Napoleon, through the late 18th into the early 19th century, engaged in a variety of military actions to gain more power and land for France. Some of those included taking territory from the Holy Roman Empire. In an effort to prevent Napoleon from gaining control of the empire, Emperor Francis II decided to abdicate as emperor and become the Emperor of Austria, which essentially dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, which had been around for almost 1,000 years. Parts of the empire that fell to Napoleon eventually became Germany. And out of the upheaval of Napoleon and his wars, new countries were created. And sometimes these new countries ran afoul of the Pope, who saw these efforts as limiting his authority. An example of this is the reorganization, or riorgimento, of Italy. An attempt to kind of pull together and unify Italians into the country we think of today. But within this reorganization, there was the question of the so-called Papal States. Regions throughout about the middle of Italy where the Pope held sway, where he acted as the political leader as well as the religious leader. Eventually, however, the Pope lost a majority of those Papal States in the reorganization and held on only to the Vatican and Vatican City, and some minor holdings elsewhere. Also developing at this time is the modern nation of Germany. In Germany, as it was unifying, Catholics faced persecution, largely due to the policies of the leader Otto von Bismarck, who both supported what was going on in Italy and feared Catholic power in Austria. Germany broke its diplomatic relations with the papacy, expelled monks and nuns, and cut any monies to Catholic clerics, which some of these were eventually restored. So in Europe, there's that further breakdown of the connection between politics and Catholicism. While Europe is going through these revolutions, similar things are happening in Central and South America as well. As Gonzalez points out, some of this is due to the tension between newer immigrants and the descendants of older immigrants. Right? And so these new people coming in from Spain and Portugal, as coming into conflict with the people that were already there of Spanish and Portuguese descent, as well as the indigenous population. There is also some concern in many of those regions because a lot of the decisions, especially religious decisions, were not made by local leaders in Central and South America. They were made by people back in Europe. So when the Napoleonic Wars and all these other things began happening in Europe, it threw Europe and Catholicism into confusion, and so Latin American colonies were able to set up independent governing authorities and start fighting for independence. Now, often these movements didn't result in freedom, it was just a change in power. Priests were often involved in these pushes for independence, although there were priests and bishops on both sides. Most of the popes through the early 19th century supported the European colonial powers, Spain, for example. But eventually the popes would go and recognize the new countries that had developed out of these revolts. When it came to Catholicism, and the Catholic leaders in places in Central and South America, the lower levels of the hierarchy, right, the priests and the nuns, often supported the people. And they were on the side of those fighting for their freedom. The bishops, the cardinals, and others were often supportive of the European colonizing powers, the status quo. They weren't interested in change. So even within the church, the hierarchy of the church, there was a lot of division. These new governments would often claim that Catholicism was the national religion, but in later years that became more tenuous as Latin American conditions and the Roman Catholic positions on certain doctrines and hierarchies began to diverge. Eventually, a lot of political officials became very anti-Catholic in their feeling, and many of these countries, at least politically, started moving away from the church.